I'd like to thank Vince Gaddis for recruiting Qasim. Qasim is an executive board member, Common Defense. He is a human rights lawyer, author, and former congressional candidate. We share that in common. Qasim received his bachelor's degree from the University of Illinois at Chicago and his Juris Doctorate from the University of Richmond School of Law. He has also served as a visiting fellow at Harvard University's Islamic Studies program. Professionally, Qasim supports major organizations, small businesses, candidates for office, and nonprofits to improve their corporate strategies, messaging, and innovation. His human rights work includes supporting survivors of domestic and sexual violence, representing asylum seekers, uplifting the incarcerated through prison chaplaincy, and advocating for universal religious freedom. He has published numerous books and academic law review articles on human rights and international law. Please welcome Qasim Rashid.
Thank you for the kind introduction, and thank you all for being here. We're living at a unique moment in history, and I think it's critical that we have these conversations out in the open where people can ask questions, have a better understanding, especially at a time when we have a governmental administration that is actively censoring and suppressing just having these dialogues in the first place. I want to start with a very important question. Why is it that we never hear media reports that prior to October 7th, 2023, Hamas killed 240 Israeli civilians, including 47 children? Why is it that we never hear from the media that Hamas kidnapped more than 800 Israeli children, held 8,000 Israelis hostage, and built more than 12,000 illegal homes on Israeli land? The answer is because Hamas did none of these things. The Israeli government did. And as a human rights lawyer, as a student of international law over the last 15 years, it is my obligation to speak truth to power on these issues when corporate media and politicians in office refuse to. And so today, as we talk about the injustice being committed, it is critical we understand the historical context of how we got here in the first place. Because until and unless we understand the history of what's happening in Gaza and Palestine right now, it is impossible for us to form any kind of meaningful solution that protects the people of Palestine, the people of Israel, for two peoples to live in peace and coexistence. So let me begin with this simple truth. If we are serious about peace, we must uphold justice as our top standard. Every life, every civilian life, whether Israeli or Palestinian, is of equal value. And we cannot entertain a scenario where one life is considered more important than the other. So let's start with the history. In 1947, the United Nations proposed a partition plan to divide historic Palestine into two states, one Jewish, one Arab. The then president of the UN General Assembly, Sir Mohammad Zafar Khan, vehemently opposed this unilateral ruling. He argued that yes, the Jewish people have suffered horrific atrocity in Europe at the hands of Europe. Why are we punishing the Palestinians for the crimes of Europe? And he went on to point out that a forced partition would not result in peace, but would only result in more conflict, pointing out quite astutely that no nation of Europe or the United States was willing to give up their own land, instead imposing this decision on people who had nothing to do with the horrific genocide imposed by Hitler onto the Jewish people. Now, despite comprising only 1/3 of the population and owning less than 7% of historical Palestine, the state of Israel was allotted 55% of the territory. Palestinians rejected this. However, they didn't have a military backing them up. In May 1948, the founders of Israel launched Plan Dalit, a military campaign that ethnically cleansed over 400 Palestinian villages. More than 750,000 Palestinians were displaced. This is a term you may have heard of known as the Nakba, the catastrophe. This set in motion, a decades-long motion in place of the injustices that we are still witnessing to this day. The War of 1967 saw Israel illegally occupy the West Bank, Gaza, and East Jerusalem, territories that are still under military occupation this day. And I've been to occupied Palestine, I've been to Jerusalem, I've been to Israel, I've seen this with my own eyes. As a US citizen traveling with former Israeli soldiers, with former US military veterans, I was ordered by Israeli military off of buses at gunpoint, forced to show my papers under threat of arrest, forced to delete pictures off my phone. Pictures not of any kind of secret Israeli facility, but pictures of occupied Palestine because they did not want those pictures getting out. So let's be clear, this is not a passive occupation. This is violent. Over the last 45 to 50 years, the Israeli government has built over 700,000 illegal settlements on Palestinian land. I want to repeat that, over 700,000 illegal settlements on Palestinian land. These settlers frequently attack Palestinians with impunity, without any form of accountability whatsoever. Right now, the Israeli government holds nearly 10,000 Palestinian civilians in prison without charge or trial. And as we look at what's happening right now with this current administration, arbitrarily sending people to El Salvador without charge or trial, understand why this matters. Because what our tax dollars fund overseas is what they will enable here domestically as well. This matters to every single one of us. And this administrative detention, as the official policy is called, includes hundreds of children. This violates the Geneva Conventions. Save the Children reports that more than 85% of Palestinian children, these are children under 18, majority under 15, detained by the Israeli government are physically abused, more than 85%. Often blindfolded, strip searched, denied access to legal counsel and family, and at least 22% of them suffer sexual abuse. In the year prior to 10/7 was the deadliest year on record of Palestinian children being killed by the Israeli military. Now, some might say, well, that's the fault of Hamas because this was in Gaza. No. Notwithstanding that's a weak argument, these are children killed in the West Bank, where Hamas has no control or authority whatsoever. That number exceeded 240 children. Civilians, innocent children killed by the Israeli military. And unless you're following this closely, this is probably the first time you even heard about it. B'Tselem, a Jewish human rights organization, an Israeli Jewish human rights organization, attests to the fact that women and children are suffering sexual abuse in Israeli prisons, that men are suffering systemic rape in Israeli prisons. Breaking the Silence, which is an organization established by former Israeli soldiers who are working to end the military occupation, attests to the fact that using Palestinian civilians as human shields was standard operating procedure and is standard operating procedure for the Israeli military. So I want to clarify, none of what I'm saying is my opinion. None of what I'm saying is from Palestinian scholars. This is all from Jewish and Israeli scholars and newspapers and media. Now, let me be clear about this as well. I said on the day of 10/7, and I say again today, that Hamas killing Israeli civilians is a war crime. And I say that unequivocally because there is no circumstance that I would tolerate killing a civilian. It's a war crime. I say that unapologetically and without hesitation. As a human rights lawyer, I condemn attacks on civilians regardless of who commits them. But the conversation can't stop there. As Palestinian-Canadian human rights lawyer Diana Buttu asserts, Israel claims that nothing justifies 10/7, but that 10/7 justifies everything. And so it's important to understand where we are today. As of today, according to The Lancet, this is a report published last July, so it's probably an undercount, but The Lancet, the world's premier medical journal, estimates at least 186,000 Palestinian civilians have been killed in this siege on Gaza. The numbers we're hearing of 40 to 50,000 are atrocious enough. The Lancet extrapolates out the effects of lack of food, lack of medical care, lack of access to basic clean water, to basic feminine hygiene, to basic needs for women who are pregnant and expecting. The United Nations Commission of Inquiry and the World Health Organization and the Independent Human Rights Council all confirm unanimously that the Israeli military has bombed over 110 hospitals and medical centers. Now, here's where it gets really painful, because the Israeli military says, well, at least 15% of them were holding Hamas militants. Even if we go with that argument, that doesn't justify bombing the entire hospital. But moreover, the United Nations inquiry studied every single one of those hospitals and medical centers, spoke to Israeli soldiers, spoke to the directors of those hospitals. And out of those 110 hospitals and medical centers, do you know how many they found evidence that Hamas was ever there? 0. Not a single example exists that Hamas was hiding in those hospitals. The Basma Fertility Clinic was Gaza's only IVF clinic. For those who needed IVF to conceive, you understand more than most how difficult it is to conceive in the first place. The Israeli military bombed it, destroying 3,000 embryos. The UN Commission also reports that Israeli snipers have shot children directly, repeatedly, and deliberately. Again, this is not speculation. This is well documented in UN reports, World Health Organization reports, Amnesty International, Bet Salim, Save the Children. The list goes on and on. Right now, what we are facing is an unprecedented block of humanitarian aid. USAID, the UN, Oxfam all confirm that the Israeli government is deliberately blocking food, water, medicine, and fuel. These are all violations of the Geneva Convention. Under the Rome Statute, an occupying military power has an obligation to ensure that food, aid, water, and other life essential resources are able to receive the population of the people that they're occupying. This is not a matter of opinion. This is international law that every country is required to adhere to, especially when they're occupying a country with military power. Now, the excuse is, well, it's Hamas that's stealing this aid. Again, the UK Guardian and multiple US-funded and US-based NGOs on the ground all attest that this is simply not true. There's no evidence of this whatsoever. And on the contrary, there's ample evidence that the Israeli military is not only blocking the aid, but is tipping off Israeli settlers to ransack these trucks and prevent them from getting through. Despite all this, the US Congress, under both Democratic and Republican leadership, has continued to send billions of dollars in aid to Netanyahu. Multiple media outlets and NGOs have reported that the Israeli military is raping prisoners at secret torture sites, bombing UN schools and designated safe zones. Even on Palm Sunday, the only church in Gaza was bombed by the Israeli military. And despite Hamas accepting multiple Israeli demands of ceasefire and release of all hostages, it is Netanyahu who has prevented the deal. Again, not my opinion. The families of the hostages themselves refer to Benjamin Netanyahu as Mr. Death, because he continues to reject the ceasefire agreements. For example, last year on May 6th, Hamas said it accepted a ceasefire proposal that included the release of all hostages. Israel rejected it. Again, on June 11th, Hamas accepted the binding UN Security Council resolution on ceasefire and release of all hostages. And this is significant because this was a UN ceasefire resolution proposed by whom? By the Israeli government. Biden backed it and refused to veto it at the UN Security Council, and it passed. It became a binding resolution. Hamas said, we accept. And the moment Hamas said, we accept, Netanyahu backed out. When ZTO News journalist Prem Thakur asked about the ceasefire, U.S. State Department spokesperson Matt Miller said, I quote, "The USA never wanted a diplomatic resolution with Hamas," end quote. In the same briefing, a few minutes later, he said, "We could have a deal if Hamas would just come to the table." Just the grotesque hypocrisy in broad daylight. Notwithstanding that, it attests to the reality that diplomacy could have released hundreds more hostages as it did in November of 2023. But war has been the calling card. ProPublica published a scathing report last summer about U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken, who defied 2 reports by his own State Department. These reports by the US State Department confirmed that the Israeli military is violating the Leahy laws. The Leahy laws were established here in the United States to ensure that our government, our tax dollars, are not funding any government that is credibly accused of war crimes. 2 US State Department reports, not one, but 2 separate independent reports confirmed that the US government is violating, that the Israeli government is violating international human rights law. It is blocking aid. It is violating the Geneva Conventions. It is violating the Rome Statute. And Anthony Blinken went before Congress and lied. Flat out lied and said that our assessment is that the Netanyahu government is not violating the Leahy laws. And just as Defense of Children International reported that the spike in Palestinians killed by the Israeli military is due to a complete lack of accountability, they added that there hasn't been a single case of accountability of the Israeli army killing or maiming a child. Just last week, a 14-year-old US citizen of Palestinian background was killed in the West Bank. And I'm guessing this is probably the first you've heard about it. The lack of accountability is enraging. So where are we right now? Well, under the 1948 Genocide Convention, genocide is defined as the intent to destroy in whole or in part a national, ethnic, racial, or religious group. And most people don't know this, but it was actually a Jewish lawyer and survivor of the Holocaust who coined this term. I've heard that, well, the definition of genocide that the UN has is anti-Semitic. Okay, tell that to the Jewish lawyer who survived the Holocaust and coined this term. Right now, more than 70% of Gaza's population at a minimum has been displaced. Entire families have been wiped out. And UN experts, including from the ICJ and the ICC, have declared that Israel's conduct bears the mark of genocidal intent. We have extensive statements from Israel's own leaders calling Palestinians human animals, promising to erase Gaza. The hardest part about proving genocide is intent. When you have a government that's a nuclear power, that has unlimited access to arms and bombs, that has more than 200 documented cases, according to a New York Times report, more than 200 documented cases of forcing Palestinians to move to a safe zone where they would not be bombed, and then bombing them in that safe zone. It's difficult to argue that the intent is not there. Put yourself in that scenario. This is continuing because Western governments, led by the United States, have chosen politics over human rights. They condemn violence when it's politically convenient and ignore it when it's done by their own allies. When apartheid ended in South Africa, it was because people organized and overcame that apartheid. Remember, Nelson Mandela was on the US terror watch list until 2008. Right? The United States government considered Nelson Mandela a terrorist until 2008 because he opposed apartheid. So where are we now? Well, this is the painful part, because where we are now is somehow worse than we were even 6 months ago. In January of 2025, after 16 months of investigations into the 10/7 attacks, after hearing on every media outlet of mass rapes committed by Hamas, in January of 2025, 16 months later, Israeli authorities admitted that prosecutors will be filing no allegations of rape or sexual assault against Hamas committed on 10/7. Israeli prosecutor Moran Gaz is the former head of the security cases of the Southern District of the Prosecutor's Office in Israel. And she was a member of the team assigned to investigate 10/7, assigned specifically to prosecute rape and sexual assault that occurred on 10/7. In an interview, she admitted that we have found no evidence to substantiate the claims of mass and systemic rape by Hamas. She went on to state, in the end, we don't have any complainants. What was presented in the media compared to what will eventually come together will be entirely different. We even approached women's rights organization and asked for their cooperation, and they told us that no one had approached them claiming that they were raped. So not only could her team find no evidence of mass or systemic rape, even with the help of women's rights organizations, they could not find a single example to prosecute. Just think about that. I mean, the devastation enacted on Gaza under this repeated claim that was repeated by Republican and Democratic politicians. So I'm not picking on one party right now. The Israeli prosecutor responsible for prosecuting these claims is admitting we can't find one single example. How did we go from overwhelming evidence of mass rape in October of 2023 to zero evidence that anything happened in January of 2025? This is a question no one in corporate media is asking, that no politician is willing to ask, but somehow it gets even worse. The Israeli government is not only refusing to act on these claims of mass rape on 10/7, they are now blocking the same UN investigations they demanded in November of 2023. Haaretz, Israel's oldest paper, reports that the UN sought permission from Israel to conduct a thorough investigation into the allegations that Hamas committed sexual violent crimes on 10/7, and they were blocked by the Israeli government. So why is Israel objecting and blocking an investigation into Hamas? Why is Netanyahu defending Hamas? That's the question that we need to be asking. The answer lies with what the investigation might reveal into Israel's own conduct. Haaretz confirms that Israel, and I'm going to quote them, that Israel fears an investigation into Hamas because of what it might expose about the Israeli government and the Israeli military. I'm quoting from Haaretz. The UN Special Representative on Conflict-Related Sexual Violence asked to investigate Hamas's alleged crimes on October 7th and towards the hostages, but Israel refused her request to access Israeli detention facilities to examine claims of IDF abuse. Israeli women's rights groups warn this could lead to Israel, instead of Hamas, being added to the UN's sexual violent blacklist. Now, again, these are not my words. These are the words of Israeli women's rights groups saying that if you investigate IDF, the Israeli Defense Force, then the Israeli government, not Hamas, will be added to the UN's sexual violent blacklist. This is also why the Netanyahu government has banned all media from within Gaza to report. This is also why more journalists have been killed in Gaza than in all global conflicts combined over the last 18 months. More than 150, according to independent organizations. So let me close with this. Unfortunately, history has witnessed genocide before, as we're witnessing it right now. And as with past genocides, whether it was the horrific genocide of the Jewish people and other marginalized communities during World War II, whether it was the Srebrenica genocide, whether it was the Rwandan genocide, whether it's the Rohingya genocide, or whether it's the genocide of Palestinians, the question afterwards were, how did we not know? Well, this is being broadcast live every single day. The question is, how do we act? Every humanitarian org agrees that right now Netanyahu has unilaterally broken the ceasefire, and he is continuing to bomb Gaza with bombs provided by the US government. The fact remains that we still have the power to speak to our politicians and demand that they speak up and stop arming a man who is bombing innocent civilians. This is not about self-defense. This is not about protecting yourself against Hamas. This is about violating the fundamental Lehi laws, the fundamental international human rights laws that ban bombing innocent civilians, that ban violating peace treaties. 2, we need an immediate end to US military aid to Netanyahu until a proper investigation can be conducted of how these arms are being spent. Because right now, everything we're seeing from every single UN report, World Health Organization, Oxfam, Amnesty International, B'Tselem, Breaking the Silence, you name it, every single one is pointing to the same thing, that these laws are being broken. We need immediate and transparent investigations into the allegations of sexual violence and war crimes being committed, both by Hamas and by the Israeli military. Let's have transparency. Sunlight is the best disinfectant. To claim that there is suddenly no evidence of rape after claiming that there was overwhelming evidence for 16 months, every single person should recognize that this does not pass any moral level of judgment. And finally, we need transparency from elected officials. I think we can all agree we need to get dark PAC money and corporate money out of politics, that is deciding how our politicians vote and how they rule. No person can be above the law, and politicians, whether they're Democrat or Republican, need to be accountable to the American people, not to foreign lobbies, not to the war machine. We should all fear anger and shame and a call to action as we watch in real time as the Israeli military uses American bombs to bomb children in Gaza, to kill US citizens in Gaza. And as we watch them die, that should sting every single one of you, because now those same policies used to indefinitely detain Palestinians are being applied to US green card holders. And mark my words, if we don't act quickly, they'll be applied to US citizens as well, right here. If they can kill US citizens in Palestine without blinking an eye, they will do the same thing over here. This is how injustice advances. We cannot surrender to despair. I implore you that hope is not a luxury, it is a duty. It is an obligation of ours. It is what sustains the parents searching for their children in the rubble. It is what compels doctors to perform surgery by flashlight. It is what leads tens of millions of people in our country and our world to stand up and demand justice. Let us honor that hope, not just with platitudes, but with meaningful action, with calls for meaningful accountability. This is what justice demands of us. Thank you.